Hello and welcome to Holy Spirit Stories. I'm Pastor Rick and I'm excited this week because my wife Sheri is going to be sharing her story as well as her parents' story and how they came to receive the baptism in the Holy Spirit. So Sheri, welcome to Holy Spirit Stories.
Thank you.
I've heard your story multiple times. But every time that I've heard it, you have always started your story by saying, we really can't understand your story without understanding your parents' story. So let's start there.
Yes, I was fortunate to be raised in a Christian home, two very godly parents. I was probably 6 or 7 when I remember accepting Jesus into my heart. And I was about 11 or 12 when I experienced the baptism in the Holy Spirit. But before I get to that, I want to talk about my dad's story. It had been several years before I was a young child when he received the infilling of the Holy Spirit. He was an associate pastor at a Church of Christ church in downtown El Paso, Texas. He had been in the El Paso area because he was in the military. He was at Fort Bliss. And so he was serving as an associate pastor at this small church with his senior pastor was a gentleman who he very much respected and who was mentoring him and teaching him how to pray was one of the things Brother Wilson did. And so Brother Wilson was encouraging my dad in his prayer life, and he encouraged him to pray for this thing called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. My dad didn't really know what it was. He of course, had seen the term in the Bible, and again, his senior pastor, who he very much respected, was encouraging him to seek the baptism in the Holy Spirit. And so one day in his prayer time, his habit was to go to the church when no one was there and to have an extended time of prayer. So one day in his prayer time, he just prayed and said, Lord, baptize me in the Holy Spirit. What happened next was obviously an incredible supernatural experience. He says he remembers waking up, laying on the floor, looking at the ceiling, and praying in an unknown language, praying in tongues. He got up and he went to call my mom because, of course, he was a little freaked out by what had happened. Called my mom, started telling her, and then immediately began to pray or to speak in tongues. So it was a very, very powerful experience. He says later he was afraid he was never going to be able to speak in English again. He called his senior pastor, and of course he just encouraged him that this truly was a supernatural work of God, and encouraged him to just continue to seek the Lord. So that was his introduction to the baptism in the Holy Spirit.
Let me interject something here to help those who are watching understand. This was miraculous in a couple of ways because your dad's religious background didn't teach about this.
Exactly. So it was all very new to him. And again, because his senior pastor was encouraging to pray for this thing called the baptism of the Holy Spirit, that's why he was doing it. But no, he had very little teaching, and it was a powerful encounter with the Holy Spirit. You know, not everybody has that kind of encounter. Why some do and some don't, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I know that he went on to have an impactful evangelistic ministry in Mexico. God did tremendous things through his ministry. He's kind of a fiery preacher, and so God just knew, based on what was coming in his life, based on his personality, that was the kind of experience he needed.
Okay. So your dad grew up in a tradition that really didn't teach about this. It wasn't Pentecostal at all. So he sought it. He asked God for it, and he got really freaked out. And so then did he become a raving Pentecostal after that?
No, what followed was he and my mom began to attend Pentecostal meetings at a Pentecostal church in the area. And he saw things some things he didn't understand, and some things that were probably out of balance, excesses that just really turned him off to the experience, and he had very little teaching. And so what ended up happening was he tucked that experience away back in a corner of his life. He turned his back on it. He did not want to have anything to do with it because he saw excesses that he was unable to explain, he didn't understand. And what he didn't understand, of course, at the time is, what we all, from time to time, will get out of balance. And there may be people that were out of balance, but he did not understand that, so he rejected everything. As he said, I threw out the baby with the bathwater, was his expression. And so he turned his back on the experience at that time in his life. So what followed was, several years later, they went into the interior of Mexico as missionaries. On the mission field, they worked for a number of years and just found the work to be very hard. They found they were working hard, there was very little fruit. And in addition to that, they were just sensing such a dryness and emptiness in their own spiritual walk. And so both of them really came to a point in their life where they just cried out to God and said, Lord, there's got to be more. We need more of you, or we cannot continue. And of course, as God would have it, he brought people into their lives at a very critical point that believed in the baptism in the Holy Spirit and were able to instruct them and teach them and pray with them. And my dad was refilled with the Holy Spirit, and my mom, for the first time, received. And again, her experience was completely different than my father's. It was a very quiet experience, but she received the infilling of the Holy Spirit.
So from the time that your dad had the first powerful encounter till this refilling, what length of time went by, approximately?
Several years. I don't know the exact number, but several years did go by. The first story, of course, I was just a very young child. I just know that because of him telling his testimony. The second time, I was, I was a young child, but I do remember that time, and I remember those experiences of them, re-receiving, or my dad re-receiving the infilling of the Spirit, and my mom receiving it for the first time. And it revolutionized their ministry. It completely changed their ministry from there on out. It was during that time that they would go out and minister in different villages, and this is where my story begins. They would go to different villages to evangelize, to go back and minister to the new believers. And there was one particular town we went to that they were going to minister to some new Christians and to teach them about the baptism in the Holy Spirit. And I guess I should back up just a bit and just explain where we lived. It was a very remote area. There was no electricity, no running water, no phones, no TVs. We had a radio, but it was kind of hit and miss on that. And so we go into this village that, again, is super remote. These people do not have access to TV, to any of the modern conveniences. For some of the places we went, we were the first English speakers that these people had ever encountered. But we went to this small village, and my dad conducted a service ministering to these new believers, teaching about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And there was one woman in particular that I very much remember who received the infilling of the Spirit and spoke in tongues, spoke in another language. And for her, it was perfect English. So as about a 10, 11-year-old child, this was extremely impactful to be listening to a woman who perhaps had never even heard English before in her life, but here she is worshiping God in perfect English.
So you saw a miracle.
I saw a miracle.
The evidence of tongues, kind of like on the day of Pentecost, because the people that came and heard the disciples heard them in their language.
Yes.
So she received the baptism in the Holy Spirit, her prayer language in tongues, in English, and it was impossible for her to have done that in the natural.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
That is fantastic. Now, Sheri's story will continue, but we're going to make you wait a week, just so that we can keep these lessons kind of on the shorter side. So we're going to make you wait for a second part, and I just want to say, if you have not yet received the baptism in the Holy Spirit, the reason we're doing these stories is to help you to understand what it is, how it's received, and different people's experiences. But for more information, just go to our church website. I have a series of messages called 7 Reasons We Should Speak in Tongues, and it speaks about the prayer language in tongues, it speaks about the gift of tongues, and this thing called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. And also I recorded a message on Pentecost Sunday, which was, 8 weeks, 10 weeks ago, called Immersed in the Spirit, or Plunged into the Spirit. That's also available both on YouTube and our church website. So that's this week's Holy Spirit Stories, part 1 of Sheri's testimony, but really this one focused on her mom and dad. We'll see you next time.